It's good to be here today. This is a very wide room, and I'm actually used to, when I speak, I like to move around a lot, but I can't because, hello, all those of you who are watching online, and there's no microphone except this one. Normally, I have a very loud voice, so I do that anyway, but out of respect for those, out of respect for the cameraman not having to like continuously pan as I pace the room. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for that introduction, Chelsea. As she mentioned, I lead the Bold Center of Excellence on Dementia Risk Reduction, which is funded by the CDC. And what the center is charged with is really to, first of all, it's part of a broader initiative that was started by Congress with the passage of legislation called the BOLD Act, because Congress felt that we needed to start thinking about Alzheimer's a lot more in a public health context rather than just an aging context. And so the BOLD Act said we need to start creating some infrastructure at the state and local levels to address cognitive issues, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, from a public health perspective. And one of the things that the CDC did was to fund 3 centers of excellence, including the Center on Risk Reduction. Our job is not to actually go out and do things, but to develop tools and resources so that we enable and empower state, local, and tribal public health agencies to address risk factors in their communities. So one of the big things that we have done is look at the science. What is the science of the modifiable risk factors for dementia, so that we are grounded in science in whatever we help and work with public health agencies to do. So I'm one of the, that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I wanted to start with showing you why there's this renewed interest in risk reduction when it comes to dementia. The National Alzheimer's Plan, just last December, for the first time since the plan was first created in 2012, added a new goal, and that goal is on healthy aging and risk reduction. So there's this increased interest, and I wanted to show you why risk reduction and the importance of it, why it is growing in importance. So today, in the United States, there are more than 6 million people living with Alzheimer's. Because of the aging of the population, that's going to dramatically take off in the coming decades. So there's projected overall to be a 75% increase in seniors in the United States by mid-century. And by mid-century, it's projected there will be 12 million more people that are 85 and older than there are today. And that's going to drive a lot more cases of Alzheimer's. And that's why the projection for the number of people living with Alzheimer's in 2060 will be nearly 14 million. Now, if that's not scary enough for you, here's the bigger rub. The projections of the number of people who will be living with Alzheimer's at mid-century 2060 are based on studies of current older people or recent older people. And if you turn back the clock to when they were my age or a little younger, there was a lot less obesity and diabetes in the United States. So if you're basing projections of future Alzheimer's on the existing cohort of seniors who had lower rates of diabetes and obesity, if those two things are causal risk factors for dementia, what happens when the cohort that is older in 2050 and 2060? And that's why that line, maybe even higher, and that's why we may need to undertake efforts to reduce the risk of dementia just to keep that line as it is, let alone bring that line down. That's the scary part. But I'm here to tell you the fun part. The solution is quite simple. In fact, it's so simple that I've written a book on it. I'm making it available to all of you here today for just $39.95. But there's what it says inside. Don't get old. It's really, really simple. Unfortunately, we've tried that path throughout history. That handsome gentleman is Ponce de Leon. And you may remember from school that he spent a lot of time wandering around what is now the state of Florida looking for the fountain of youth. He never found it. There are a lot of snowbirds that are continue to look every winter when they head to Florida, but no fountain of youth. If you remember mythology, you may remember the story of Tithonus and the god Eos. And Eos was in love with Tithonus. The problem was Eos was a god, so was immortal, and Tithonus was a man, so he's going to eventually die. And Eos was so in love with Tithonus, she begged and begged and begged Zeus to give Tithonus immortality. And finally, Zeus said, I've had enough of Eos, I'll give him immortality. And she was so happy. Tithonus would never die. But Eos forgot one thing. She forgot to ask Zeus to give Tithonus eternal youth. So Tithonus never died, but he got older and older and older. And as far as we know, he never got Alzheimer's, but he did turn into a cicada. So the story goes. So the simple solution of not getting old is unfortunately not available to us. And the fact is there is no simple solution. The fact of the matter is the risk for Alzheimer's is a very complex situation. It involves a lot of variables. And I want to talk just a minute, just as a foundation, a couple of the unavoidable, unmodifiable risk factors. So the first one is age. Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging, but it is the greatest risk factor. Here you can see the percentage of the population that have Alzheimer's. So 5% of people 65 to 74, but by the time you get to people 85 plus, it's a third of those people. Remember what I said earlier, the projections are in mid-century, there'll be 12 million more people in this country 85 plus than there are today. And a third of people 85 plus have dementia, have Alzheimer's. Family history is also a risk factor. If you have a parent or a sibling that has had Alzheimer's, you're at higher risk. If you have more than one of that direct connection, more than one parent, more than one sibling, you're at an even higher risk. And then there's some genetics involved. So the one that affects all of us is, I won't try and say the science name because I always botch it. We call it ApoE. So this is a gene. You get one version of the gene from your mom, one version of the gene from your dad. There are three versions. It's ApoE allele 2, allele 3, and allele 4. And the evidence shows that people with 2 copies of allele 2 are at lower risk. People with 2 copies of allele 4 are at higher risk. In fact, if you have 2 E4 alleles, you're 8 to 12 times greater risk of developing Alzheimer's. There's no guarantee. There are people with 2 E2 alleles who develop Alzheimer's, and there are people with 2 E4 alleles who don't develop Alzheimer's, but the risk is greater with that gene. And then there is genetic mutation and then Down syndrome. The genetic mutation affects less than 1% of people with Alzheimer's. So most people that you've come in contact with that know have Alzheimer's, this is not, the genetic mutation is not in play. There are 3 particular genetic mutations, but if you have that genetic mutation, you'll see 2 of them, you're 100% chance of getting Alzheimer's, and 1 of them's 95% chance. And you're likely to get it very young, 30s and 40s. Again, this is less than 1% of the total cases, so it's rare. Trisomy 21 is, of course, the third chromosome that is associated with Down syndrome. And you can see there that people with Down syndrome who live into their 50s, about 30% of them have Alzheimer's, and about half of people with Down syndrome who live into their 60s have Alzheimer's. But the thing about genetics, because I don't want everybody to walk out of here, well, everybody gets old, and everybody has genes, so we're kind of screwed. Genetics, according to the best evidence, accounts for only about 15% of the risk for Alzheimer's. There are a lot of other things in play. Now, the key with what I've just showed you is that all of these things are unmodifiable. As much as I don't want to get any older, as much as I'd like to change families every other week when my sister or brother do something that just irritates me, I'm stuck with them. I'm stuck with my genetics, I'm stuck with my family, and I'm stuck with getting older. But in the vast majority of cases for Alzheimer's, it's a very complex process. It's a very complex set of interactions that result or may result in Alzheimer's and dementia. And while there are unmodifiable risk factors that we just went through, there is an increasing body of evidence that I'm going to talk about here this morning that there are modifiable risk factors. There are things that can be done to decrease your risk or, if you're a bad boy, increase your risk. Certain medical conditions, certain lifestyle factors, social determinants of health, which is a big thing that we're looking at right now, social determinants of health related to dementia risk. All of these can come into play. And according to the Lancet Commission, about as much as 40% of the cases of dementia around the world may be attributable to modifiable risk factors. So that gives you hope. That gives you hope. So I'm going to talk about those modifiable risk factors in the current state of the evidence. But before I do, I want to make a couple of preliminary points. So the first point is that most of the evidence that these conclusions are based on come from population-level observational and epidemiological studies, not clinical trials. Now, there are some people who that's like a big deal with. You know, I've been in meetings where people say you can't say you can do anything about Alzheimer's because there aren't very many randomized controlled trials. To which I point out there has never been a randomized controlled trial showing that smoking causes lung cancer, and yet there's no one in this room who doesn't believe that smoking causes lung cancer, and there's no one in this room who believes that from a public health standpoint, there's a table just outside the door that we should actively try to get people to quit smoking. Similarly, there was no study in the 1980s that showed condoms prevented the spread of HIV, and yet we know that condoms prevent the spread of HIV. There's been no randomized controlled trial that says wearing a bicycle helmet will protect you from head injuries, and yet we run campaigns to encourage people to wear bicycle helmets because we know it will protect against head injuries. And finally, the former chief medical officer of the Alzheimer's Association always liked to say, there has been no randomized controlled trial proving that if I walk over to you and rip out your spleen, that's a spleen, that you will die. But I guarantee you, if I walk over and rip out your spleen, you're gonna die. So I say that because a lot of times we can get too hung up on this. Has there been a randomized controlled trial? And for those of you who are providers in the room, I'm gonna address this point in a second. But while there's a lot that we're still learning from this epidemiological and observational evidence, from a population public health standpoint, there is strong enough evidence on certain things to begin talking about it and to begin encouraging it from that population public health perspective. But that brings me to the next point. Because this is not largely randomized controlled trials, this is not largely clinical evidence as opposed to population level evidence, I'm not going to tell you today what you should be doing as providers. Listen to the epidemiological evidence, listen to the population level evidence. This is what we're working with public health agencies on, because this is evidence from the community and population level. But as providers, you need to take that evidence and you need to decide how to use it in your own practice with the patients that you see. I can't tell you that because where the evidence comes from. But it is something you should know, because it is something that you may want to consider using in clinical practice. About 6 weeks ago, I was in London at the conference of Alzheimer's Disease International, and they had a physician speaking in one of the sessions, and he said that he was all for talking to his individual patients about risk for dementia based on population level evidence, but said we need to be honest with our patients about what we know and what we hope or what may. So I just say that as a preliminary point. This is about understand the context in which I'm presenting the evidence and the conclusions that we're reaching. The last thing is, because there's a lot of ongoing study, ongoing uncertainty about this. You know, there was an abstract submitted to Alzheimer's Association International Conference, AAIC, last year for our conference. And the abstract was, we did a literature review and found that there were 364 different risk factors for dementia that had been published. 364. I'm not going to go through all 364 with you today. Some of them had one study. Some of them, it turned out there was no evidence of it as a risk factor. But that just shows you the volume that's out there. And because there isn't a lot of clinical trial data, it leaves open the possibility that we get hooked on what I call shiny objects or easy answers. So the dental fillings is what's causing your dementia, or the aluminum foil. You know, when I worked in the Senate, when I started my career in the Senate, I answered mail, constituent mail. And I remember there was one person who wrote probably about once a month, and he was always writing about how he made sure to go outside wearing an aluminum foil hat to prevent the aliens from brainwashing him. And I thought, great, you're gonna prevent the aliens from brainwashing you, but you're gonna get dementia because aluminum foil, you know. Seriously, you know, you got to watch for those shiny objects. Similarly, blueberries. This, you know, there's a study about blueberries that pops up every now and then. I love blueberries. Blueberries are healthy for you in many ways, but be wary of the easy answer. I can prevent dementia by eating blueberries every day. Similarly, reading a book. There's actually an organization that did up bookmarks. Read a book every day and prevent dementia. You know, that's an easy answer, for which there isn't, I think there's been one study about daily reading. You know, so there's not a lot of evidence, but it's an easy answer. And when the evidence can be so confusing, when there are 364 things people are talking about in the transom, it's easy to latch on to those shiny objects or easy answers. And so I encourage you to be wary of that. All right, so let me tell you where we are in terms of the state of the evidence, the population level epidemiological observational evidence. And I'm gonna get a little help doing this from two friends of mine. So do you know who this person is? So if you watch Will and Grace, that's Will. And if you're even older, and watched Beverly Hillbillies, that's Ellie Mae. So Will and May, sorry for the graphics there, but Will and May are the two words to keep in mind as we go through this evidence. So we'll start with Will, and I'll talk about what will affect your risk of cognitive decline and dementia. So the evidence is strong enough, this will affect. These things will, the evidence is strong enough. And we start with education. People with more years of formal education have greater protection against developing dementia. We've known this evidence is really strong and has been out there for a long time. We've known this for a long time. Most people believe that what's going on here is something that they call cognitive reserve. That is, there's something about the process of formal education that develops extra neurons, extra synapses, extra connections in your brain, so that when you get the biological, pathological changes associated with Alzheimer's disease, you get those brain changes, there's more to attack because you've got more neurons, more synapses, and so there's more to attack. So it takes you a lot longer to get to the point of having visible, observable symptoms of decline. Because sitting in a classroom, getting a degree, going to school doesn't somehow magically prevent the changes in your brain. It just gives you this reserve in your brain. That's the theory. But there's also something else going on here, because we know that lower education is associated with lower socioeconomic status. And we know that lower socioeconomic status is associated with poor nutrition. It's associated with less access to healthcare, less treatment within the healthcare condition for things like cardiovascular diseases, and people with lower socioeconomic status have more exposure to air pollution. We also know that lower levels of education are associated with less physical activity, more hypertension, more diabetes, and more obesity. So, which you'll hear in just a second, you'll hear me repeat all of those words: diabetes, obesity, hypertension, physical activity. You're gonna hear that as we go through these risk factors. So the other thing that is working here with education is because lower levels of education are associated with a lot of other things that may be risk factors for dementia. So the evidence is pretty strong. There's also in the will category, will affect your risk for both cognitive decline and dementia as traumatic brain injury. There's pretty solid evidence here that moderate and severe TBI will increase your risk of developing certain forms of dementia, not necessarily Alzheimer's form of dementia, but definitely certain forms of dementia. And repeated head injuries will increase your risk even more. And if those and the younger those head injuries happen, are likely to increase your risk even more. It's unclear at this point what aspect of TBI is driving this. The other thing that I found fascinating with TBI, so as part of the center to do, to review and synthesize the current state of the evidence, we worked with our partner at Wake Forest Medical School. And I learned this in this process, that traumatic experiences at an early age by children can have the same effect as a head injury. And that is things like when you're very young, violence, abuse in the home, witnessing substance abuse in the home, having a family member who's incarcerated. These things have been shown to actually interfere with the neurodevelopment of the brain in young children, and can have the same effect as a fall, a head injury from a fall, or sports, or a car crash, or falling off your bike. All right, so based on that, stay in school, go to college, and protect your head. Now, after that, it gets a little bit more nuanced. So I've got to bring in Ellie Mae. The next things I'll talk about are things that will affect your risk of cognitive decline based on the evidence and may affect your risk of developing dementia. So the first is midlife hypertension. Really good evidence that midlife hypertension increases your risk of cognitive decline, may increase your risk of dementia. And there's both epidemiological and, in this case, some randomized controlled trial evidence that aggressive management of hypertension can lower your risk. So getting hypertension in old age is going to increase your risk, but there's a growing body of evidence, including clinical trial evidence, that aggressive management of that hypertension will bring your risk back down. Sprint Mind is the big study. It found that aggressive treatment of hypertension down to under 120 systolic blood pressure did decrease the risk of mild cognitive impairment. The study's been extended to follow those people longer to see the effect on dementia. And I want to make one other point about hypertension. I didn't put it on the slide, but in this country, we have a problem with clinical trials in that we don't have a lot of diversity in clinical trials. Clinical trials in this country are overwhelmingly white, which makes it very difficult to know about differences by race and by ethnicity. The cool thing about the Sprint Mind study, it was 30% Black and nearly 11% Hispanic. So that gives us confidence that this aggressive control of hypertension is something that is going to work across communities and across populations. Midlife obesity. So there's compelling evidence that midlife obesity increases your risk. So my next bullet says less compelling evidence, and I want to pause here for a second to just explain what I mean by less compelling evidence. I don't mean that there's no evidence, right? So when I say there's less compelling evidence of something, it's not that it's untrue. It's not that there's no evidence. It's just that we need more study. There's been some conflicting evidence perhaps, or it's not quite as strong as something that I would say has compelling evidence. So there's compelling evidence that midlife obesity will increase your risk of cognitive decline, may increase your risk of dementia. There's less compelling evidence that obesity is preventable, and there's less compelling evidence that treating obesity, once you have it, will bring your risk back down. Remember I said with hypertension, really good evidence that you can even after you get it and your risk goes up, if you're able to successfully and aggressively treat it, your risk will come down. There's less compelling evidence that's true with obesity. Continue studying it, but it's less compelling. And I should also note that the relationship between late life obesity and dementia risk is a lot less clear. There have been some studies that have shown it is not a risk factor. There have actually been some studies that show it's somewhat protective, obesity in old age. But again, not enough for me to conclusively say anything, but it is that midlife obesity that's the important key here in terms of the state of the evidence. Next up is diabetes. So type 2 diabetes will increase your risk of cognitive decline, may increase your risk of dementia. And unlike obesity, there is compelling evidence that obesity is preventable through lifestyle interventions. The thing about, talked about hypertension, talked about obesity. I'm going to talk about more stuff, but if you're noticing a theme here, a lot of these things are about heart health. And that's going to become even clearer as we go through these. But when it comes to diabetes, not only may the risk be driven through vascular pathways, your heart health, but there may be some biological mechanisms of diabetes itself that is causing the dementia. So that means then that avoiding diabetes will keep your risk down. Getting diabetes and treating it, there may be issues there about getting your risk back down, because while that may help your heart health, if the causal link is by a biological mechanism, you may not be able to drive the risk back down as great. So next, we were talking about smoking. Very strong evidence that smoking will increase your risk of cognitive decline, may increase your risk of dementia. It also, evidence shows, will shorten the lifespan of somebody who has dementia if they continue to smoke. There have been a couple studies that show heavy smoking in midlife can increase risk by as much as 50%. But the good news is that there is very strong evidence that quitting smoking brings your risk back down to the level of a never smoker. So from a public health standpoint, I'm sure from your patient standpoint, that's some good news here. Physical inactivity, which I think we all experienced about 2 years of a lot of physical inactivity. I watched a lot of Netflix for 2 years. Did not get a lot of exercise for 2 years. But in observational studies, again, epidemiological evidence, aerobic exercise results in higher cognitive function, has positive effects on brain volume, and will decrease your risk of getting cognitive decline and may decrease your risk of dementia. The big question mark with physical activity is the prescription or the dose, that is frequency, duration, and intensity. In other words, how much, how often, and for how long. And that studies vary all over the map, so we're unable to pinpoint that exact prescription. But in general, vigorous, regular aerobic activity is good for your heart, and and it will protect you against cognitive decline. Sleep. I'm in trouble on this one. So we know, and we have known for a long time, that people who have dementia have problems sleeping. The dementia causes sleep problems. Increasingly, we're seeing the opposite also be true. That is, people who have sleep problems may be at higher risk for dementia. We do know that sleep is important for maintaining cognitive health, so it is, poor sleep will increase your risk for cognitive decline, and it may increase your risk for dementia. The exact nature of what's going on here and the relationship between sleep and cognitive health is still unclear. A lot of the study on sleep has really only been published about in the last 8 years. There's been a huge volume of it, but it's a relatively new thing to have been looking at. So it's still under study about whether, is it the number of hours or the lack of hours of sleep that's causing the problem, or is it the quality of your sleep, or is it sleep disturbances? So that is still a subject of study, but in the observational studies and observational data, people who get poor sleep are at higher risk for cognitive decline. The other thing I'll say is, as many of you know, good sleep quality is also important for cardiovascular health. It's also important and protective against obesity and diabetes. So even if it turns out that we don't find a causal link between sleep and dementia, the causal link between, or the link between poor sleep and these cardiovascular problems may therefore indirectly affect dementia, because if those are then a risk factor, that poor sleep driving the heart health, which eventually will drive the brain health. All right, so that was both Will and May, and so now it's just Ellie Mae's turn all by herself. So the last two items that I'll go through in detail are things that the evidence shows may affect your risk of cognitive decline. The evidence on dementia is still at a lower level such that we're not comfortable elevating it to the Will and May level. And that first one is diet and nutrition. So a healthy diet over the long term may improve your cognitive health and may reduce your risk of cognitive decline. For a long time, the evidence was about a dietary pattern, such as the Mediterranean diet or the MIND diet or the DASH diet. More recently, the evidence seems to point that those specific diets are less important than overall balanced nutrition. There are some randomized controlled trials, and the limited trials do actually, so far, support the epidemiological evidence that that a balanced nutrition will protect against cognitive decline. The interpretation of this evidence is somewhat complicated because it's been shown that dietary pattern is very closely tied to socioeconomic status and social determinants of health. And the last thing is, this is about a balanced diet. It's not about the supplements. Supplements are not a substitute for balanced nutrition when it comes to possibly protecting you against cognitive decline. In fact, the World Health Organization specifically called this out. Using dietary supplements is not a proven or recommended strategy to reduce your risk of cognitive decline. And then lastly, cognitive stimulation. So there have been systematic reviews. There have been some randomized controlled trials that have looked at recall among people who regularly engage in cognitive stimulation or go through cognitive training programs. There's greater recall in those people who go through formal cognitive training programs sitting in a classroom. There's improvement in that trained skill. But most trials have been fairly small. A lot of them have inconclusive data. And so the jury's still out on this one. I think where the evidence is strongest is keep your brain active, right? It's about stimulating the brain, challenging your brain throughout the course of your life. That if there is evidence here and if the evidence does develop, then again, we think there's enough evidence to say this may affect your risk of cognitive decline. But it's probably more just keep that brain active, just like you keep your body active in physical activity, keep your brain active. And it's less the formal come to a training program or do a brain training program on the computer. Is probably more just you need to keep your brain active and challenge your brain. So that's the end of Will and May. And for those of you who are like, oh, wow, that's hard, I'm going to have a slide in just a minute that puts it all together so you can see it all on one slide, the Wills and the Mays. But before I do that, I do want to mention a couple of others. Again, I told you I was not going to go through 364. What I just went through, the 10 I just went through, are the 10 that have the overwhelmingly strongest evidence. But there are others that are often mentioned that have stronger evidence than a lot of the other 364, certainly have a lot more evidence than the aluminum foil, and you'll often hear about them. So I did want to mention them because if I come back in 4 years and give this presentation again, some of these things may end up with Will and May. I keep wanting to say Will and Grace, but Will and May. So first is hearing loss. This is a really hot topic in the research space right now. There is evidence that there's some link between losing your hearing and cognitive decline. We need more study, more peer-reviewed studies, and we need better evidence to determine whether interventions, some of which can be low cost, some of which can be high cost, but whether interventions will help reduce your risk back down. Air pollution, this is the other really big hot area of study. At our International Science Conference last year, there were a ton of studies about air pollution. But it's very early in the research, and it's much like sleep in that we don't really know whether it's the, how much exposure, what age of the exposure, how long you were exposed to the air pollution. Those are questions that can only be answered over time. This is really, as I said, this is a hot topic, but it's a relatively new area of study when it comes to dementia risk. Depression. So there's definitely linkages between depression, cognitive decline, and dementia. Absolutely linkages. The problem in interpreting the science on this is that it's unclear whether a person who has depression, whether that then causes dementia, or whether there's some underlying thing going on in the brain that gives you depression when you're 50 and dementia when you're 80. And so it's unclear whether there's definitely a linkage, but do they have a common cause, or is one the cause of the other? And that the research is still out on. Hyperlipidemia, high cholesterol. There was a recent study that showed actually high levels of good cholesterol were protective. Again, it's a study that came out, but it was a fairly large study. But when we're talking hyperlipidemia, we're talking high levels of bad cholesterol. The evidence is unclear. And the evidence is really inconsistent that even if hyperlipidemia increases your risk, whether use of statins will bring the risk back down, that's also unclear. Alcohol abuse. Excessive and prolonged use of alcohol has been shown to result in some permanent structural and functional damage to the brain. So if alcohol abuse is a risk factor, the damage may limit the ability of abstinence following abuse to bring risk back down. The good news is it's off the page. Of course, the good news went off the page. The good news is moderate alcohol use. So there are some studies that do show that moderate alcohol use may be protective. A couple of studies have shown that it will lower your risk by about 25% compared to somebody who abstains from alcohol consumption. Again, these are some studies. It's on this list. It didn't get a slide of its own, so we're not there yet on the definitiveness of the evidence. And then the last thing that's definitely off the page is social engagement. That's meaningful interaction with other human beings. That's something else we didn't have a lot of for a couple of years. And social engagement, for those of you who work in the aging space, social engagement has been seen for a long time as a key component to healthy aging in general. But now there's studies that are starting to look at the connection between social engagement or social isolation and the risk for cognitive decline and dementia. I will say that social engagement is different than loneliness. There are often people who are socially isolated are often lonely, but they don't have to be, and you can be lonely without being socially isolated. My family lives, I live in New York. The rest of my family lives on the West Coast. I'm kind of a jerk, so I don't have any friends. So I'm really socially isolated. But I can tell you right now, I am not lonely because I have some of the best conversations with myself. I I love my own company. So I'm not lonely. I'm socially isolated. So the key here is loneliness is something that people are studying about whether that has an effect on your cognitive health. But there is a difference between social isolation and loneliness. And that's important in terms of if you were to address it as a risk factor, you want to make sure at least the stronger evidence now is that what you need to address is making sure that somebody has opportunities for interaction, not that we figure out how to stop you from being lonely. All right, so all of, I went through each of those and reviewed the evidence of these as the standalone risk factor. So hypertension is a risk factor, obesity is a risk factor, physical inactivity is a risk factor. But remember what I said very early on. Alzheimer's and dementia are the result most often of very complex interactions. And so it may not just be one thing, just as it's not age alone, just as it's not your family history alone. It may not be hypertension alone. And especially because a lot of those things all dealt with your heart health. So there's these interactions between them. So there's been an increased interest in the field about studying multi-factor approaches to reduce risk. The big study here was the FINGER study out of Finland. There's the acronym for FINGER. I'm not going to try to, I can't remember. But the FINGER study was the first published randomized controlled trial that looked at a multi-domain intervention's effects on cognitive health. And the intervention involved physical activity, nutritional guidance, cognitive stimulation, social activities, and management of cardiovascular risk factors. The control group got information about all those things but did not get a structured intervention. Those who got the structured intervention had significant improvement in their overall cognitive performance, and executive function. It was such a big thing. This was first reported back in 2014. This was such a big thing. Everybody's like, maybe we've found the answer. And so that prompted the development of multiple studies around the world that are modeled after the FINGER study. It's called, collectively, they're called worldwide FINGERs. The study here in the United States is called US Pointer. Again, I'm not going to try to, well, the acronym is really weird. I can't even figure out where they get some of the letters to make the acronym. Those of you who are in the room are smarter than me. You can figure out how U.S. study to protect brain health through lifestyle intervention to reduce risk, how you get pointer out of that. But anyway, it's a 6-site randomized controlled trial that will be going through 2024. 2,000 adults engaged in the 6 sites. Again, the intervention is physical activity, diet, cognitive stimulation, and management of cardiovascular health. So to summarize, because this all probably got very confusing. So we'll start by summarizing. I'll start summarizing the scientific conclusions. I'm going to pull all those slides together, and then I'm going to give you 2 key takeaways that I believe the science leads us to. So the first, with our help of my friends again, so education and TBI will affect your risk of cognitive decline and will affect your risk of dementia. These 6 things, midlife hypertension, midlife obesity, smoking, physical inactivity, diabetes, and poor sleep, will affect your risk of cognitive decline, may affect your risk of dementia, and balanced nutrition and cognitive stimulation may affect your risk of cognitive decline. That is where we believe the evidence currently stands from an epidemiological and population level. And the key takeaway here, as I've said it several times, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. If I were to draw one conclusion from that scientific evidence, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. The population level evidence suggests that cognitive decline and dementia can be reduced by focusing especially on cardiovascular risk factors. In fact, there's Will and May put into a table, right? So cognitive decline on the left, Will and May, dementia on the right, Will and May. Now let me add to that the American Heart Association's Essential 8. So this is their Life's Essential 8 to Heart Health. And you'll see that of the 8 things, 7 of the 8 things that the American Heart Association says are essential for your heart health are things that are on our Will and May chart. Just underscoring that link between what's good for your heart is good for your brain. The other takeaway I would leave you with is that I really believe the burden on communities of dementia, of cognitive decline, can be reduced through good, aggressive public health efforts. Here's where you stand today in Tennessee when it comes to the 6 risk factors, not education and TBI. These are the 6 that will affect cognitive decline, may affect dementia, so these 6. I often call them the big 6. And there you can see for hypertension and midlife obesity, the little type at the bottom, that's the prevalence of people age 45 to 64, because remember, those are midlife risk factors. The World Health Organization defines midlife as 45 to 64. I remember when my brother turned 35, my mom kept referring to him as middle age, and my brother is like, I'm not middle age, I'm not middle age. He didn't know about the World Health Organization, so couldn't whip it out as evidence that, see, you're not middle-aged till you're 45. It wouldn't have mattered for my mother in the argument. She was going to win that argument anyway. So what that's saying is that almost 50% of people in Tennessee who are between the ages of 45 and 64 have hypertension. You can see the 3 on the right, diabetes, physical inactivity, and sleep, are all adults, and you can see over half of all adults do not meet the physical activity guidelines. Sleep, data on sleep is hard to come. It's hard to come by. Remember, so when I said we're not sure, it's hard to find how many people are experiencing sleep disturbances. It is much easier to measure hours that the average number of hours people get at night. So I use that, understand that may not be the key to the risk of sleep, but I wanted to just give you kind of some sense of where things are. And about 1 in 8 adults in Tennessee get less than 6 hours of sleep a night. And the extent to which there is literature on hours of sleep as a risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia, 6 seems to be kind of the tipping point. Overall, 71% of adults in Tennessee have at least one of these risk factors. 37% have 2 or more of these 6 risk factors. And the situation for African Americans in Tennessee is, for those of you who work in this space, probably already guessed, is more troubling. 78% of blacks in Tennessee have at least one. 43% of blacks in Tennessee have at least 2, indicating that addressing risk factors is important for everybody, but is particularly important for the African American community. So let me conclude on the burden point by showing what I think is achievable from a nationwide perspective. Taken where we are on the prevalence, I believe the evidence, the data, the modeling shows that an aggressive effort on the part of public health to address dementia risk factors, assuming everything I talked about is causal. That's the caveat here. Assuming all of those things are causal risk factors for dementia. Making that assumption, an aggressive addressing of those risk factors could bring that orange line down I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, down by about 1 million Americans in 2050. And I'll show you this is really, really tiny type, so you probably can't see it. but these are, it's 4 analyses of what would happen under different scenarios if there was an aggressive effort to address risk factors. So the first are 2 unpublished analyses. They looked at 5 risk factors: midlife hypertension, midlife obesity, diabetes, obesity, and physical inactivity, those 5. And the top one said, if between now and mid-century, if we can get a 15% improvement in the prevalence rates of those 5 things, so every decade reduce the prevalence by 15%, not 15 percentage points, but 15%. 15% less hypertension, 15% less diabetes, 15% more physical exercise, that in 2050 there would be 1.4 million fewer people with Alzheimer's. The 2018 analysis did a little bit different. They said, let's assume there's a 15% reduction in the prevalence of these 5 risk factors in the first decade, so that, really big, strong push. And then we're not going to assume we're going to reduce prevalence any further than that, but we'll assume we'll have a 15% reduction in the new people who are developing those risk factors. They found 1.1 million fewer cases in 2050. And then you have a published study in 2014 that looked at 7 risk factors, those 5 plus 2 more. They found 775,000 fewer cases. The caveat there is that they used a different baseline, so they were working off of a different orange line graph on what the prevalence of Alzheimer's would be in the future. I redid the analysis and said, if they had assumed the prevalence projections that I showed you here, it would have come out as 1.2 million fewer cases instead of 775. And then there was an analysis done for the Federal NAPA Advisory Council. That's the Alzheimer's Advisory Council for the federal government. It looked at 8 risk factors, assumed that 15% per decade improvement, and resulted in 1.2 million fewer cases of Alzheimer's. So that takeaway, what's good for your heart is good for your brain, and we can make a difference in this space. So I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you. I hope you've got something out of it for those of you who are clinicians and providers. Again, I hope this sparks some thinking about how you might work with patients. That's your decision based on the epidemiological evidence. But I hope you have a better picture now of where things stand, and there might be a little bit of hope. So thank you.